The misconceptions of negotiation as a concept. Negotiation is a concept that is almost impossible to avoid in our daily lives. We negotiate to get the best bargains, we negotiate to get an improved paycheck, we negotiate when we want other people to see things from our perspective. Although we have engaged in the art of negotiating since we were kids, very few have discovered the right strategy to ensure that negotiations generate wise agreements. In the author's words, a wise agreement is an agreement that meets the legitimate interests of each side to the extent possible, resolves conflicting interests fairly, is durable, and takes community interests into account. Considering how unlikely two or more people with opposing views and arguments would reach this type of agreement, it becomes important that we treat the factors that contribute to broken or distorted negotiations. We're fascinated by the words, but where we meet is in the silence behind them. Ram Dass. More so, there is a lingering misconception that effective negotiators are those that know how to stall, until the opposing party tires and gives in. Another misconception that has evolved into a myth is that having your way entails that you assert your views as much as you can. While both approaches have their short-term results, forcefully imposing yourself on another person will, in the long run, breed resentments and a breakdown of relationships. Neither hard positional bargaining nor soft positional bargaining is effective. In a typical negotiation, each side takes a position, and the ensuing argument and counter-argument focus on maintaining these positions or manipulating the other person to give up their position. As such, it is common practice for people to take up the most extreme of positions, so that the agreement reached falls within a desirable range of options. Take for instance the price negotiation that ensues between a retailer and a customer. The retailer could quote a price that is way higher than the cost price, let's say $120 for a product that costs $60. On the other hand, the potential buyer could start his bargain from $50. Note that both the customer and the retailer have taken a position. Here, the retailer chose the $120 position, because he thinks that the customer will eventually agree to a price that guarantees a profit. Rather than start with a figure that would make it seem like he is holding out, he has taken one that would trick the customer into agreeing to buy the product for $70 or $80. As such, emphasizing on positions, when negotiating, could blind you to the real intentions of the other person. It tricks you into attempting to see a false common ground that is disadvantageous to you. Another thing about positional negotiations is that, in most cases, each side of the divide explore two distinct ways of imposing their positions. An individual can rely on hard bargaining that involves assertions, threats, or anger. In contrast, the opposing individual could adopt soft positional bargaining, which means he or she is likely to reach a compromise quickly to avoid pressure or tension. Soft and hard positional negotiations are two sides of a coin, and unfortunately, both are not efficient frameworks for reaching a wise agreement. The former shy away from touching on the best available options since compromise is the goal, even though the agreement is partial or biased. The latter does not mind if hearts are broken, blood is spilled, or bridges are burnt, so long the resolution aligns with the position of the negotiator. A more viable form of negotiation is the principled negotiation. It is the fine line between hard and soft negotiation. This type of framework separates the argument from the people, it looks for the options that mutually appeals to both parties, it does not obsess about positions, and it is open to reason. Attack the problem, not the person. The principle negotiation only works when a negotiator chooses to see beyond his or her emotions and beliefs. You have to understand that there is no need for negotiations if your view of how the world works is the standard that should guide everyone's motives. Two or more people negotiate because they need to reconcile varying vantage points until one single view incorporates the variance in each person's beliefs. And so, the authors list three components of negotiations that could either cripple the process or fast-track and implement wise agreements. The first is perception. Perceptions, as mentioned earlier, are distinct even when two people have access to the same information. It comes from a place where biases and information filtering mechanisms dominate. Therefore, negotiations would yield good results only if you put yourself in the shoes of the other negotiator. Ascertain their perception, respect it, understand it, and acknowledge it. Let us never negotiate out of fear. But let us never fear to negotiate. John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Also, you must not let your perceptions govern the way you judge the other person. Do not blame them for your problem, as blame does nothing but compound issues by feeding your fear while distorting your decision-making process. Instead of relying on blame and ignoring your contributions to the issue, you should give the other person a stake in the outcome, and invite them to be a part of the resolution process. Note that a one-sided negotiation would not generate the sort of result you want. The second component is emotions. Emotion is always an integral contributor to the smooth sailing or sinking of a negotiation. In light of this, you must identify the role of emotions in the problem. Verify that an attack on your identity is not inducing a blind spot. Likewise, do some soul-searching and ensure that your anger is not a masking agent for your true emotions. The same way, try as much as possible to analyze the emotions of the other person. While tackling the other party's emotions, you should allow them to express their emotions, and do not try to downplay them. There are chances that emotions will uncontrollably come sprawling to the surface. When this happens, allow it to play out, and do not react to these outbursts. Identify the interests that each person represents and communicate your concerns explicitly. Positional negotiation is a flawed framework since it focuses on the position of the negotiators and not the motives. There is no way you would resolve a dispute, or find common ground if you do not consider your interests and that of the other person. For instance, two negotiating individuals could take opposing positions and share the same interests. Similarly, an individual can agree with your position and yet have contrasting interests. As such, you must always ask the whys motivating the other person's position. Also, ask the why not that is stopping him from reaching an agreement. And have it at the back of your mind that positions are often spurred by multiple interests. In other words, they do not reflect the complexity of the factors that trigger them. 16. Note that the most compelling concerns are basic human needs like security, acceptance, economic well-being, recognition, and autonomy. Therefore, it is advantageous to communicate your concerns as explicitly as you can. Before you make known your position, you should start the negotiation by explaining your motives. This approach will keep the other person's attention fixated on your underlying interests, and not your position. Furthermore, when both parties have stated their interests, the next step is the invention of options. Although the two of you have made bare your motives and the decisions that best suits you, it is unlikely that the other person will jump at your proposed agreement, even if they share the same interests with you. So, you must invent options that both of you will mutually benefit from. As easy as this sounds, it entails a level of creativity that fickle reasoning will not generate. Hence, you should brainstorm with people that are on your side of the divide, and those that are on the opposing side. Understand that brainstorming with the opposing side is tricky. You could divulge information that might undermine your bargaining power, or that could falsely lead the other person to believe that you could accept a particular settlement term. It is clear that the individual who persecutes a man, his brother, because he is not of the same opinion, is a monster. Voltaire. Here, you do not want to assume that there is only one possible answer to the problem. Neither do you want to subject the issue to a for or against scope. Most importantly, you could look at the argument from the perceptions of different experts. And try as much as possible to broaden your search for an answer. More importantly, do not limit yourself to the obvious things that present themselves as viable solutions. You will only avoid this pitfall if you invite the other person to have input in the decision-making process. Although it is difficult to drive home your points without utilizing threats, it is, however, more productive to explain to the other person the consequences of their position as well as yours. This brings us to the role of principles and objective criteria in decision-making. The most compelling way to present your argument is to use governing standards and criteria. You may ask the other person the standards that had informed his arguments and use these standards to remodel your argument. What do you do when the negotiator is more powerful? The well-crafted arguments, mentioned in the previous chapters about the effectiveness of standards, principles, and interests, become redundant when the opposing negotiator has more bargaining power. They have less to lose, and so, you consciously try not to push them to abandon the negotiation, which could prove detrimental to you. However powerful or imposing the other guy is, you can use two diffusing tools to ensure that you do not find yourself at the mercy of his decisions. First, you could set up a bottom line, which will serve as the worst acceptable outcome. With this in place, you will have the fortitude to fight temptation and pressure to accept a mediocre offer. Nonetheless, utilizing bottom lines could backfire, as it pushes you to base your decision on a rigid framework. It blinds you to other opportunities or scenarios that would make your bottom line unfeasible. Bearing this in mind, the authors advised that you adopt a more flexible tool that highlights your bargaining strengths, regardless of how unpromising your position appears to be. Wealth is not about having a lot of money, it's about having a lot of options. Chris Rock. The authors call this tool the BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. This tool simply defines the alternatives you have when the negotiation breaks off. Many negotiators avoid contemplating the worst-case scenario because they choose to believe that the other party would remain rational. Since the rationality of human is not something to bet on, it is, therefore, imperative that you explore other options, even before the negotiation begins. Once you carefully formulate a BATNA, the other person who earlier seemed imposing will automatically lose a substantive amount of power on the outcome of the negotiation. This assertion is true because you are no more putting all your hope into reaching a favorable offer or agreement. Likewise, you need to improvise when the other person is showing no signs of being as liberal and open-minded as you are. She has no interest in exploring principles or bantering on standards, all she cares about is her position. If this is the situation that you find yourself in, then you practice what the authors call the negotiation jujitsu. This practice entails that you do not respond to an attack on your personality. Instead, you should deflect these attacks on the problems. Similarly, do not attempt to attack their position, rather, you should look beyond their apparent rigidness, analyze it, and conclude on potential interests that could fuel their hard positional bargaining. Also, it is futile to defend your ideas when the other person keeps attacking them. To counter this, you should embrace criticisms, use them to formulate new ideas and diffuse their hostility by asking for their advice or inputs. In this case, it is advisable to use questions in place of statements. You could also pause whenever you are under attack, so you could gather your thoughts, and not act on impulses. Be aware of the numerous dirty tricks that negotiators utilize. It is one thing for a negotiator to dig in his position just to have the last say. It is another when he deploys various psychological tricks that could propel you to want to end the negotiation quickly or to give up your leverage. Therefore, you must identify the numerous tricks the other person might use on you and look for ways to sidestep them. Once you discover that a negotiator is using dubious means to trick you into reaching a concession, you should renegotiate the rules of the game. Let them know that you are aware of their strategy. However, you should not do this in a condemning way. Rather, focus on the trick and not the person utilizing it. A lie that is half-truth is the darkest of all lies. Alfred Tennyson. Likewise, it is advantageous that you fixate on the interest that might have spurred the person to rely on deception. Also, stick to principles and objective criteria, and resort to utilizing your BATNA only as a last option. So, the question is, what are the ways people might try to manipulate your decision-making process during a negotiation? The most common way is deception or false insinuations. Some could intentionally hide important facts from you. They could lead you to believe that they have a say in the agreement when clearly, they do not. This form of deception is geared towards reaching a preliminary agreement, which the real person that has a say would use as a starting point for the second round of negotiations. On the other hand, they could start psychological warfare by dictating the environment, location, or time of negotiations. The other persons could attack your personality to distort your thought process, or they might adopt the classic good guy, bad guy routine. Whatever might be the case, do not join the deception rollercoaster by conjuring your deceptive tricks. Conclusion. Negotiations do not have to be an excruciating or exhausting experience that could lead to a breakdown of communication, or that could leave you feeling bitter and short-changed. There is a way you can sidestep common mistakes, reach wise agreements, and maintain healthy relationships. This move would ensure that the present negotiation does not have negative effects on future ones. Try this. It is imperative that you turn your focus from the position of the person that you are negotiating with. Instead, question his motives, unroot his intentions, and build your argument or offer around your findings.